Section 15 of The Able McLaughlins by Margaret Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The year's calendar of color was almost at an end. Only white was left for it now. The fields had been black. They had grown green, shyly, softly. They had given themselves up to bold greenness. They had achieved their golden maturity. They had reveled in gold and dazzled by it. They had faded into dullness and browns. They died and lay withered. Snows would come soon for their burial. The morning's white frosts were the promise of it. Kirsty must keep the door shut now, for the baby's sake. With doors shut, the house seemed a trap from whose windows she had often to be looking to reassure herself. Out of doors she felt safer, freer. So she said that the baby must have more air, and she took him day after day to the field, where Wally was husking corn. Since the mosquitoes were no longer hungry, the baby's face was free, for the first time in months, from red blotches. He grew rosier and rosier in the cornfield. He looked so blooming that Kirsty said she just had to take him visiting, to show him to the neighbors. That was another excuse for not staying at home alone, another which Wally pretended to be deceived by. It happened one morning, Squire McLaughlin, riding past, saw a flock of wild turkeys alight in her dooryard, and, leaving his horse, he crept toward the house to borrow Wally's gun and bring down a bird for dinner. He had all but gained the house when out of the door shot Kirsty, crying out a cry unintelligible. Out of the door and down towards the corn she flew. It gave him a startle, as he said afterwards. He didn't know what terrible thing might have happened. He started after her. He called to her questioningly. She never lessened her pace. He said later that he had never seen a woman run as fast as she did. He could scarcely keep within sight of her among the dead cornstalks. He happened to see Wally hear her cry of anguish and his swift, leaping answer. The squire called to him, and Wally heard him, and stopped, confusedly, and began calling to his wife. "It's Uncle Wally, Kirsty! It's only Uncle Wally!" he called to her, as if he had some great news to give her. She stumbled against him, panting and white, and the squire hurried on to them, in consternation. There the three of them stood, breathless, excited, looking blankly from one to the other. "Whatever's the trouble?" the squire gasped, recovering first. Kirsty had grown red with relief and humiliation. "Oh," she stammered confusedly. "Oh, I just thought you were a tramp." "You were never running from me, Kirsty!" he exclaimed. "Yes, I was. I just thought you came up so quietly I didn't know." She paused and looked at her husband beseechingly. "I got a fright," she murmured. Wally knew what she thought. Pitiful she was, just pitiful, standing there, trembling, ashamed, trying to cover her folly. Let the squire laugh as loud as he would. Let him fill the prairies with his relief and amusement. He said he had never seen anything so amazing. Him to be chasing her, frightening her more and more. He didn't know he looked so much like a tramp. The birds must have been as frightened as she had been. She had spoiled a fine shot for him. He had supposed the house was on fire, at least. "I hope they were scared. I don't want them shot. I'm taming them. They come every morning," she retorted. She wanted to make him forget what she had done. He stood laughing at her indulgently, amused because she was a pretty thing. "Come back to the house, and I'll give you a slice of cold turkey that father shot yesterday. Wasn't it a good bird, Wally?" She started back towards the house. Wally went with them. After all, it was nearly noon. She begged the squire not to tell what had happened. She had been having fever, and it would only worry Isabel McLaughlin to know she was so flighty. He promised, but she saw from his face he was already making a fine yarn about how he terrified women. She knew he wouldn't be able to keep it to himself. That hour Wally came to a great decision. He had been considering for some time a proposition a cousin of his had made to him, a son of the squire's. Next spring, the railroad would have completed its track to its next western terminal, and the new station, which would become a town, was to be but 3 miles from Wally's farm. From that town, all the supplies that settlers must have would be hauled 100 miles west. What they would need, first and always, would be lumber. The squire's John wanted Wally to leave his farm and start with him selling lumber. Wally would have a little money, and the cousin had some, and for a great wonder, they knew where they could borrow more. The money they could borrow was a thing which even in those days startled men's minds. Wally's cousin John had an aunt who had come with her husband, a miller from Scotland, and had settled some 100 miles away, where Houghton could get work in a mill. His employer was an old Yankee of some wealth. In the winter of '60, the old man had decided suddenly and irrevocably to sell the mill, and the Houghtons had wondered where they would be able to find work anew. The miller had ordered Houghton to find a purchaser. His orders were always imperious and startling. Houghton had set about the task, and had persuaded 2 men to buy the plant, which he promised to manage. They had come and looked the place over carefully, but just as the papers were to be signed, they had changed their minds, so that when the miller was already rejoicing erratically because of his freedom from responsibility, he found himself still encumbered with the business. He was beside himself with anger. He was determined to sell that mill at once, without delay. He wouldn't wait. So it came about that almost before he knew what he was doing, Houghton himself had bought that mill, with 50,000 bushels of wheat for 50 cents a bushel, paying down for it all the money he could raise, which was $85. The miller had simply bullied him into the bargain. Houghton was overwhelmed with the burden of so great a debt. He felt that he had been basely taken advantage of. Then, in a few weeks, came the war. The first thing he knew, he sold his wheat for 3 times what he paid for it. Wealth has perhaps seldom fallen so suddenly upon a man so little dreaming of it. Houghton bought at once 10,000 acres of Iowa land, and nowadays his sons, who go round and round this stuffy little stupid globe in their yachts, berate his memory, yawningly, because he didn't buy 100,000 acres. He was the man who would lend 2 soldiers of his kin a few $100s to begin business. Wally had thought, before the balm of Peter's return, that farming was no life for Kirsty. She was no tireless woman like his mother. Malaria was a hard thing for young wives and nursing mothers. Wally had often wished that in some way he might make her necessary work lighter. And now that this intolerable menace of violence hung over their home, it seemed best altogether to leave it. He knew what his father would say to the idea that a man getting $1.70 for wheat should leave his land. His father thought, a man who left off tilling his land to dig gold out of it, a poor shiftless creature. None of those who would advise him so vigorously against his contemplated course could foresee that wheat, that brought so great a price that fall, would the next year be selling for 30 cents. But after Kirsty's flight from her uncle, Wally didn't care what they advised. He wouldn't have his wife trembling. He would give his answer to his cousin at once. They would move to town. A Sabbath some weeks later, Wally and Kirsty and Bonnie wee Johnny were at Isabel McLaughlin's for dinner, and the squire was there, with several of his smaller children, and the McNairs. The women and the girls were clearing away the dinner things in the big kitchen, and the men had withdrawn to the Sabbath parlor, where the best rag carpet was, and the basket quilt spread on the bed. In the stiff propriety of that room, they had been talking with less cordiality than usual. McNair had only scorn for Wally's folly in leaving his farm, and Wally had no great patience for his father-in-law's disapproval. He had been saying that he would get a renter, and McNair had commented scoffingly that that was a likely thing. Who would rent land that could be had almost for the asking? The place would go back to weeds, he averred. Wally protested that he would never allow that. Somebody would come along glad to get a bit of broken ground for a crop. If not, he would drive back and forth from town every day and care for it himself. That would be great farming, McNair had remarked significantly. Farming was just now beginning to amount to something. Look at the years they had spent, miles from markets. Consider the money they had lost before the war, when they had got for their produce greenbacks, which depreciated in value before they could get them spent. And now, when the iron horse was here to serve them, when their millennium was at hand, Wally was going to quit farming. They never called the railroad anything but the iron horse at that time and place. Hadn't they prayed for its coming? Hadn't they waited and paid in their hard-earned dollars for its advent? John McLaughlin himself had contributed $300 when the subscription paper went round for funds to help out the prospective builders of the road, and McNair himself had been moved to give $150. Well, that money had been wasted. That company had failed. But now, now the day was at hand. They had the land. The nation needed food. The railroad solved their last problem. How rich they were to be! They sat, exulting in hope of years that were to be born, starved and dying. And now the young men talked of selling lumber. The Keiths came driving in, and the men joined the women in the kitchen to welcome them. Even the children playing at the door followed them in. Libby Keith took off her hat and wrap, and gave them to a niece. She was more gray, more flabby than ever now, and her eyes were dull and brooding. But just as she went to sit down, Bonnie wee Johnny came in, and she saw him, and instantly her face grew soft and warm with tenderness, and her eyes grew bright. She ran and knelt down on the floor, and folded her arms about him. "Oh, the bonny wee laddie!" she murmured, kissing him. "Oh, the gay little un!" And then, kneeling as she was, she turned her face up towards her old husband, and exclaimed, "Look, John, is he not like him?" The unimportant John, peering intently out of his kindly old face, smiled down on them, sighing. "As like as two peas," he said gently. Then Libby, fumbling with one hand while her other held the little boy, pulled from a pocket in her voluminous cotton skirt a picture in a little case. No other woman of her class had dreamed in Scotland of aping the gentry to such an extent as having a picture of her children made, but Libby Keith had, of course, gone without food to save the necessary money. She could starve more easily than lose the remembrance of those tender child faces of hers. She opened the case and looked at it intently for only a moment. Then she handed it to Isabel McLaughlin. "Look at this, Isabel. You said he was more like Wally." Isabel took the picture and looked at it. Tears came unexpectedly into her eyes. There before her was Libby's Davy, a little innocent, broad-faced laddie, with his arms protestingly around his sister Flora, who, with her head shyly on one side, looked out at the world with wondering round eyes. And seated before them, on a stool with a fringe, one leg crossed under him, sat little Peter, with a plaid cap lying proudly in his lap. Isabel blinked away her tears. "Ah, Davy was like that," she murmured. And then she turned and looked at her grandson still in Libby's arms. He had on his best Sunday dress that his step-grandmother had made for him, of scarlet wool nun's veiling, a little frock that Kirsty keeps to this day folded immaculately away. It was low in the neck, and had no sleeves to hide the soft, dimpled arms. Around the neck and the flaring skirt were 3 rows of very narrow black velvet ribbon. Kirsty had curled his hair that morning around her finger. The curls at the back of his head were still in shape, and the long one that came down the top of his head to his forehead, disarranged as it was, still showed what a soft, sweet thing it must have been before his romp with the children. And there in the frame, Isabel looked at what might have been the picture of the child before her. The very forehead, the same childish nose. Only little Johnny had a winsome way of screwing his mouth into smiles which he must have got from his secret grandfather Keith, who, quite unadmired, stood watching him indulgently. Isabel McLaughlin said gently, "You're right, Libby. He's like it. Peter is a McLaughlin, if ever there was one." And having taken away any cause for apprehension that Kirsty might have had, and having given her husband's family a little knock from which, under the circumstances, the 2 McLaughlin men were not able to defend themselves, she handed the picture calmly to Kirsty, saying again, "It might have been our baby's picture." She never again had any doubt about the paternity of the child. And so simply had she justified the resemblance, that Kirsty studied the picture unabashed, with a natural interest. The picture was handed from one to another, and Wally, when he got it, studied it intently. No one noticed him doing it. Libby Keith had sighed again, and said, just about that time, "To them that hath it shall be given. Them that has sons has grandsons." Wally looked up from the picture to her, and wondered if it would have comforted her to know that the child so brutally begotten was indeed her grandson. Not that it made any difference, of course. He wouldn't tell her in any case. He hated that little picture. It had possibilities against which he couldn't fight. And the women were saying to the baby, "Say Aunt Libby, Johnny. Come on now, say Aunt Libby. Say it, baby. Look, he's going to say it." They had reason to think so. Johnny prepared for action. He pursed up his red lips. He looked around upon his admirers, complacently, happily. All eyes were upon him. He let them wait a moment. Then he manipulated his lips more earnestly. The great moment was at hand. Brr, he articulated proudly. Brr. Various aunties dived for him, rewarding him with laughter and huggings, enthusiastically. Was there ever so silly a baby? Ever a bairn so lovable? They asked. It occurred to Wally casually that perhaps the secure son of Wally McLaughlin was a more fortunate being than the unfathered offspring of Peter Keith would have been. End of section 15. Section 16 of The Able McLaughlins by Margaret Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The corn was husked. The year's work in the fields was over. Wally had sold, from 60 of the acres for which his father had paid $210 in '64, wheat worth $3,060. He had his house all paid for now. He owned 300 acres of land, some of it a bit farther west, where a bushel of wheat still bought an acre of faithful soil. His little pines had grown steadily, and his orchard, now that the grasses and weeds were frosted, was visible to the naked eye from the house. A lot of little switches ready to stand bravely against the gales. Everything prospered with him. Everything, except for that shadow of evil that clouded their lives hatefully. Every day, Wally's mind dwelt futilely upon the problem of Peter Keith's fate. And Kirsty's eyes, he observed, still shifted apprehensively under their tender lids. And what was he to do now, when he must go to the timber for his winter's supply of wood? When he must leave early in the morning and return at nightfall? He couldn't leave her alone. He had remarked to one neighbor and another that he wanted some man to bring his wood home for hire, but he found no man willing to do his work. Kirsty would have to take the baby and go to her father's or his mother's. She didn't want to do that. Either Wally would have to take her back and forth daily, and that was a difficult thing under the circumstances, or else she would have to stay away for days together, and then Wally would come home to a cold house and no food ready. They dreaded those days. He finished the corn on a Wednesday, and on Thursday they were to have a great lark. They were to go to town together for the first time. He had a wagon load of prairie chickens to sell, which ought to bring at least $10. Silly birds he had caught, almost without effort, as he husked his corn. Everything was ready. For one day they would put aside all their misgivings and be happy together. They were enjoying what seemed to be a second Indian summer, bland days for riding across the country. And there was that spring seat ready for Kirsty's comfort. Moreover, she was to have a new coat. Wally had wanted to get her one the fall before, but she had said that there were so many things that they had to buy for their house that they really couldn't afford the coat. She still protested that she really didn't need it, but Wally was the more determined because he suspected she wore her mother's old wrap for the principle of the thing, as if she needed to act humble. He wouldn't have it. The store in which they found the right coat, finally, was narrow and dark and full of dull necessities, mittens and milk crocks, grim boots, and grimmer tobacco. Wally hated the clerk the moment he saw him fix upon Kirsty eyes that narrowed expressively. Nevertheless, the odious man brought out from some dark recess behind the main room the very garment they were searching for. "Put this on," he urged familiarly. She put it on. It was a green thing, so dark a green it was almost black, and rich-looking, short in front, and falling, mantle-wise, well down over her skirts behind. It had rich fringe on it, and intricate frogs for fastenings. Wally would have forestalled the clerk and buttoned it for her, but his fingers were awkward and helpless in such a task. So the man did it, standing as near her as he dared. But when she stood forth arrayed, Wally's annoyance was forgotten. He heaved a sigh of satisfaction. He saw again, with surprise, how garments change women. She was scarcely the same being who had walked in that faded old dingy wrap. This coat was made for her, beyond a doubt. She asked the price. $16. She sighed and began undoing it. She would look at some others, she said. The man left them. "Don't you like it?" demanded Wally. "It's too fine for me. $16, she commented. "It's not too fine. It's becoming, Kirsty." "But $16, she exclaimed, as if that settled the matter. $16 isn't going to break us up," Wally urged determinedly. "It's a grand coat. It's nobby." He was at a loss to express his admiration for the garment. He only felt vaguely that it looked like Glasgow. "But $16, Wally! The idea!" "You'll have it anyway." "I will not." She was indignant. "Why, Wally, your overcoat was only 10 last winter." "But I hadn't any red dress to match, nor any feather." The man had come back. "If you want something cheap now for your wife—" "I don't want anything cheap," said Wally. "We'll take this." Kirsty stood examining it inside and out. She was wondering what her father would say to such a coat. She wore the nobby coat anyway. Wally carried the old garment. He had been gay, almost hilarious all the morning, ever since selling the prairie chicken so well. And now, as he looked at his stunning wife, walking demurely along in such grandeur, his spirits rose higher. He watched people look at her. He chuckled to see them. They walked down the busy little street. He left the old coat at the hotel. She saw a shawl she admired, and he wanted to buy it for her. But she was thinking how nice it would be for his mother, a little soft, fine shawl like that. He wondered that he hadn't thought of that himself. They bought the shawl and went on down the street. They came to a place where tintypes were taken. It came over him in a flash. "We'll go in and have our pictures taken," he exclaimed. "Oh," she said, hesitating. "How much will it cost?" "Oh, nothing much," he exclaimed. He made her go in with him. There was a picture, was there, he was thinking, that made wee Johnny look like the son of that snake? Well, there should be another, that made him look like another man's son. Kirsty had never had her likeness taken, but Wally had had his made in St. Louis, to be sent to his mother. He knew how to walk in and have the thing done grandly. He sat down in a chair and put the baby on one knee paternally. On the other knee he spread out a great hand. Kirsty took her place behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her feather curling down over her hat, her new $16 coat, her wine-colored skirts showing bravely. And when that was done, he made her sit down with the baby on her knee for a picture of just the mother and son. And then a further happy thought came to him. He sat down and took the baby and cuddled his face right up against his own and demanded a picture. "It ain't usual," the photographer protested. "I can't take a picture like that. It ain't usual." "This ain't no usual baby," Wally replied, chuckling. Who could have made a statement more paternal than that? "I want his face against mine." And he got the picture taken that way in the end. They sought the street again. Kirsty was rather overcome by her husband's grandness. He had such a worldly air, commanding people about. He kept getting more imperious, more happy all the time, though he was entirely sober. After a while, when it was growing dusk, he spied a friend on the street, just going into his office. "That's Mr. Knight, Kirsty. You remember? The man that drove me home that time. I'll take you to see him." He wanted to show her to everybody. They went into an office, having not only a kerosene lamp, but a lamp with a rich green shade, most luxurious, most metropolitan-looking. Kirsty was shy, and Mr. Knight puzzled for a moment. "I'm McLaughlin," Wally explained. "The soldier you drove out to Harmony 2 years ago. I was sick, you remember?" Mr. Knight's face lighted up with recognition. "Come in, McLaughlin," he said heartily. "I didn't recognize you. Sit down." Around a table at one end of the room, men were playing cards. Well-dressed men, who paused and looked up, and continued looking at the newcomers. A tall, wide bookcase screened off one corner into something like a private office, and to this Mr. Knight led them. "My wife," Wally said proudly, as he seated them. "Your wife, your baby! Why, it doesn't seem possible. How the time gets away. And where did you find her?" he asked, so frankly pleased with her appearance that she blushed more deeply than she had at his first remark. "She's from out there, from Harmony." "She is!" he exclaimed. He continued looking at her. "Well, I always said that was a remarkable country, a remarkable country," he drawled. Wally was delighted. Knight was a man whose opinion was valuable, a prosperous man, a man dressed as men dress in cities, whose interest, he felt, was not merely assumed for political ends. "How's your mother?" he went on. He asked about the children and the crops and the new town which was to be near them. Finally he said, "Well, you certainly don't look much like you did that morning. You were sick, skin and bones. Do you remember?" "Do I remember?" exclaimed Wally. "Will I ever forget?" He turned to his wife. "Kirsty, I was sitting right down there by the elevator, where the sidewalk is built up high, you know. I wasn't sitting, either. I was lying stretched out to try to keep from throwing up. I thought I'd seen Jimmy Sproul out there, and I'd ride home with him. And when I hurried up to him, it wasn't Jimmy at all. It just made me sick. And I was lying there when Mr. Knight came along and began asking me what was the matter with me. He said he would take me home. 'How far is it?' you asked. And when I said 26 miles, you said, 'Oh, 26 miles.' Naturally, that made some difference. My heart sank, as they say, or maybe it was my breakfast trying to get out. Anyway, I had a pang of some kind, and you said, 'You wait here,' and pretty soon along you came with those grays. I tell you I felt better even then. I got better all the way home, every step. It seemed that morning as if I couldn't wait another minute to start home." "Naturally," remarked Mr. Knight, looking again with a smile at Kirsty. "Oh, I didn't know her then. If I had known her, I'd have started home crawling. Have you got those grays yet?" asked Wally, suddenly curious. "No, I haven't." The man smiled reminiscently. "I wish I had, sometimes. A Chicago man came along and wanted them. He was determined to have them. I let them go for half a section of land in Lyons County. I wouldn't have done it," he added confidently, "only my son had a baby born a day or two before that. I thought the land would be a good thing to keep for the child. How old is this little fellow?" He snapped his fingers invitingly towards the child. "Oh, he's a year or two, something like that, isn't he?" he asked his wife. "Tut, tut, McLaughlin, you need experience. When they're young like that, the women count them in months. Don't they, Mrs. McLaughlin?" he appealed. "How old is your grandchild?" Wally parried boldly. "Oh, mine's several months. Well, he's got 2 teeth already." And they laughed. Wally hastened to safer ground. If he wasn't careful, someone might ask him when he was married. "I'll tell you another thing I remember," he began. "I got in on that night train that time, and I went to the hotel where we had always stayed. Sick I was, I told the man he'd seen me a dozen times before that I hadn't the price of a room. He'd had too much. He never even looked to see who I was. Just saw my uniform and began swearing. Wasn't going to be eaten out of house and home by a lot of begging soldiers, he said. It nearly knocked me over. I went out to the street, and I couldn't get up face enough to go some place else and ask for a bed at first. I just sat around. Then finally I went to the Great West. That's where we all stay now when we come in. And Pearson there almost began swearing at me because I said I'd pay him later. He didn't take soldiers' last cents away from them, he said. He saw how I felt, and he went and got some milk toast made for me, and soft-boiled eggs. And then, do you know what he did? He went to a room with me, and when he saw the pillows on the bed, he went and got me a pair of good pillows from some place. I hadn't slept on a pillow for I don't know how long. A man notices those things when he's most dead, I tell you. Milk toast and pillows, by Jiminy! And in the morning he sat and fed me such a lot of breakfast. No wonder I had trouble. I felt as if I'd never get enough to eat." Mr. Knight made him go on talking. They sat there till the street was dark, and then Wally led his wife away, right up to the hotel, and then into the dining room. It seemed lordly to her, that dining room. An amazing day, and Wally most lordly and amazing of all. It was like a fine wedding trip, almost, that day. End of section 16. Section 17 of The Able McLaughlins by Margaret Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. They had breakfasted together before daylight, and he had gone to load the lumber he was taking home for his father, so that they might have a very early start. In the noisy, untidy hotel office, she sat watching, in surprise, the confusion and the stir. There were crowds of women waiting near her, women like herself, waiting for wagons to take them on towards the west, women with bundles and babies, and quarreling, crying young children. Kirsty's face showed how exciting the scene was to her. She looked from group to group. She considered a foreign woman with a handkerchief tied on her head, whose tiny baby coughed and wheezed distressingly. She longed to say something sympathetic to the stolid mother, but she was too shy. Between caring for her own vigorous son and watching other women's children, the hour hurried by. Presently she saw her husband drive up and get out to tie his horses, but before he had started for the hotel door, a stranger accosted him, and with the stranger Wally turned and went down the street. So she waited on. Two sets of youngsters quarreling drew their mothers into the fray, and Kirsty shrank away from their roughness, thoroughly shocked. Then, before she had expected him, Wally was standing over her, reaching down for the baby. She scarcely knew him. His face was white. His eyes were shining strangely. "What ails you?" she cried. "You're sick, Wally. What's the matter?" "I'm all right," he said sharply. His voice quivered with feeling. He couldn't trust himself to speak. His mouth was set in a hard line. She rose and followed him, frightened. She got into the wagon, and he handed her the baby. He climbed up beside her, and they were off. She saw he couldn't tell her what had happened just there. She could wait a little. They were almost out of town now. "Wally, what's the matter? Are you sick?" "I'm all right." She was more anxious than ever. She waited till the baby was asleep in her arms, and then she laid him carefully down in the little box in which Isabel McLaughlin had taken her babies back and forth to town. Then she turned towards her husband with determination, and hesitated. He looked too stern, too fierce. She sat undecided, wretched, glancing quickly at him and then away. After a few perplexed moments, her face darkened with terror. "Oh, I know! You've seen him! You were like that on the 4th." He turned toward her, trying to speak. "Yes," he broke forth, "I saw him dying." "Oh, dying!" She tried to realize it. "Oh, if he's dying, then we'll be happy again." He said nothing. His lips worked. "I won't have to be afraid now." She spoke like one overcome by a great fortune. He had never imagined she had been as unhappy as that cry of hers indicated by its relief. "Dying," she repeated, tasting the sweetness of the word. Then, suddenly, "How do you know? Where did you see him?" She saw his face harden with hatred. "Wally, are you sure he's dying? He isn't dead yet." "He's dying all right." After a moment, she exclaimed, "But how did you find him?" "Somebody told me just as I was ready to start home." "Oh, that man! I saw that man speaking to you. How did he know to tell you?" "They were looking for someone to take him out home." "Oh, they were!" That seemed to have changed the situation for her. "You mean they asked you to bring him out?" He didn't relish her questions. "Yes." "And you wouldn't do it, would you?" She approved. She clasped his arm with both hands. She rejoiced in her assurance. His anger flamed again. "Likely I'd bring him out with you." "Oh, we'll be happy now, Wally." But after a minute she stirred uncomfortably. He felt her face grow grave. "Where was it you saw him, Wally?" "In a livery stable." "In a livery stable!" she repeated. "Dying in such a place! Dying seemed not so sweet a word now. But why didn't he send word home before? Think of Aunt Libby, Wally. He came in on a train last night. Oh, she exclaimed, enlightened. He wanted to get home alive. What's the matter of him? She asked again. Hemorrhage, said Wally, as shortly as it was possible to speak. He wouldn't tell her how he had seen that snake, lying bloody, dirty, sunken helpless on a bed of straw. He urged his horses on. She looked at him. He turned away from her troubled eyes. After a while, "Look here, Wally," she faltered. He gave her no encouragement. "After all, he was Aunt Libby's baby," she sighed. "After all," he sneered. He meant to silence her. She spoke again. "Aunt Libby was always kind to me, Wally." He wouldn't answer her. He knew what was coming. She said timidly, "I doubt we ought to go back and get him. If he's dying, Wally, and Auntie waiting there for him." He never said a word. "He may be dead before she sees him if we don't." "We won't!" he almost shouted. That should have settled matters. "But what'll you tell her? She'll ask. She'll find out you wouldn't. You won't can say you saw him dying and didn't bring him home." That was true. He had begun to think of that. Libby Keith would leave no detail of that death undiscovered. "Will you say you went away and left him there to die?" What else could he say? He certainly wouldn't tell that for one long rejoicing moment he had stood looking into the eyes that so terribly besought him, those eyes that were dying prayers, ultimate beseechings, and had turned victoriously away. He wouldn't say that he had told the men who were seeking a ride home for that snake that he had too heavy a load for so essential a favor. He wouldn't tell how shortly he had answered them, and how hatefully turned on his heel and departed. "Wally," she said, after a little, with conviction, "we ought to go back and get him. We can't treat Auntie this way." "Can't we?" he exclaimed bitterly. "Giddy up!" he cried to his horses. He felt her wretchedness. He hardened his heart against her sentimentality. Presently she said imploringly, "We can't do this, Wally. We must go back." "I will not." He spoke passionately. When she spoke again, it was to warn him. "If you don't go back, I will." "No, you won't," he cried. She was silent for several minutes then. He felt her bending down to see if the baby was covered. Then she sat still. She was hesitating. Then, after a minute, before he could realize what was going on, she had climbed over the side of the wagon. Her foot was on the hub. Then, skirts and cloak and all, she had alighted, backwards, stumblingly, from the wagon. By the time he had pulled up the horses, she was the length of the wagon from him. Ignoring him, defying him, she was calling to him over her shoulder. "He made me do evil once. You made me do evil once. But nobody can make me do it again." Down the road she ran. "I'm going back to him," she cried. He had never been really angry with her before. Sometimes, at first, before the baby had been born, he had grown very weary of her importunity, her determination to make him tell his mother the truth. But of late she had not done that. She had been so satisfactory, so lovely. Now his rage burst forth against her. "Go back to him, then, if you like him so well." He hurled the words after her and drove on. Even before he heard her cry of protest, he regretted his bitter taunt. Furious with himself, with her, he hurried west. Already he had begun to see the mistake of his sweet refusal. It would inevitably become known that he had seen Peter's straits, and had refused him so slight a kindness. The whole neighborhood would be asking the reason. He vowed to himself that he would not take that carcass into the wagon with his wife, if all the world had to know the reason of his hatred. Such things were expected of no man. He was only human. He couldn't do a thing like that. And his wife had defied him. She had left him. Ah, and he had taunted her so unjustly, so brutally. But he had never imagined himself saying so cruel a thing to her. He had never imagined her defying him in such a fashion. That was what she thought of him then. He made her do wrong once. Classing him with that damned... That was all the gratitude she felt for his saving of her. But then, of course, it was an awful thing he had just done. He thought of himself lying sick on the sidewalk, waiting for a chance to get home. He hardened his heart. But he had been a decent man, no violator of women. He would never do it. He turned and looked after his deserting wife. He could see her hurrying away from him. He had an idea of shouting to her to come back, of commanding her to come back. But he knew she wouldn't heed him. He ought never to have said so hateful a thing to her. As if she could want to go back to that. He remembered how she had sat sobbing on the doorstep when he first went to her. He was glad to think of Peter Keith dying there, lonely, shrunken, filthy. He looked again after his wife. She went steadily eastward, running towards the town. But he had the baby. She would be coming back after a while. He drove on, raging against her, trying to justify himself. He went so far that he could scarcely see her now. He might have gone on home, if there had not appeared on the horizon a team coming towards him. Its approach was intolerable. Somebody who might know them was coming nearer. Somebody would see Wally McLaughlin riding westward, and presently overtake his wife running east. He turned around abruptly. Facing east, he could just see her. He would quickly overtake her, and order her to get in and come home with him at once. He would never let her go to that livery stable full of drunks, alone. He was getting near her. Then a strange thing happened. He saw her stop, and suddenly turn around, and come half running towards him as fast as she had run away. He kept his face hard, unrelenting. He saw when she came near that she was crying softly. She climbed quickly up when he stopped. "I doubt he's not dying," she wept. "I can't do it. He's too strong, Wally. He's tricky." She cuddled against him. "Don't cry," he had to say. "I won't look at him," she sobbed. "You know I don't want to go back to him. You oughtn't to have said that. You know I don't like him. If you want to know how much I hate him, I'll tell you. It was me that shot him that time. It wasn't his foot I was aiming at, either." She wept unrestrainedly. "You shot him?" Wally gasped. "He would come back. What could I do? There was no place to hide. I shot at him." She had shot him! She had been as desperate as that. He was horrified anew. She bent down to feel the baby's hands, to cover him more securely. She wanted to say something else, but she couldn't speak plainly because of her sobs. Yet she managed to urge the horses eastward. "I'll never look at him," she cried passionately. "You needn't think I like him. You oughtn't to have said that." "I know it, Kirsty. I oughtn't to have said such a thing. But you oughtn't to have jumped out and run away that way." "Yes, I ought," she retorted, swallowing, choking. "I couldn't help it. It wasn't my place to do it, but my husband wouldn't do his part. Wally, if you hurry now, hurry enough, they'll just think you've been unloading. You won't need to explain. I won't have you doing such a mean thing. I've got enough bad things to tell without that. Hurry!" They had passed the bridge on their burdened way home. They had come to the place at which Kirsty had so astonishingly defied him. They had ridden together in a silence broken only by the refreshed wee Johnny's cooing, as he bounced back and forth in his mother's lap. Wally looked covertly at his wife from time to time, in awe. She wasn't thinking now what a nice baby Peter Keith had been. Never once had she turned her face towards what was in the wagon box, to see if it was indeed dying. Returning to town, she had instructed him, womanlike, to be sure that Peter had no weapons concealed, no way of hurting a benefactor. And Wally had unloaded his lumber, raging. Caught, he was, trapped. Having to do this unspeakable thing to satisfy the sentimentality of a woman, and to save his secret from desecration. Grimly, he had made sure from the doctor that there was no chance of Peter living to reveal what Wally had so well kept hidden. Coldly, he had ordered the men at the stable to wash the blood from that face, from that matted beard, as if Peter was their cousin and not his. Grudgingly, he had helped them deposit the bony thing in the wagon. Covered to his head, still as a bag of meal, Peter lay there when Wally McLaughlin drove to the hotel to get his wife, and she had never once turned her head towards him. And now, when Wally looked at her from the corner of his eyes, his own anger, his bitter hatred, seemed a small thing before hers. Her face was as white as marble, and as hard, one might have thought. Her mouth was screwed tight in loathing. She sat perfectly still, looking straight ahead, tragically. She wasn't thinking of Aunt Libby now. Wally was almost afraid of her, afraid certainly to offer her comfort. They rode west. The sun was high now, and shone dazzlingly over the brown stretches. The horses felt the stimulus of the frosty morning. Wee Johnny jumped about, chuckling out his absurd, little, meaningless words. 3 miles they went. 4 miles. From time to time Wally turned to assure himself that his enemy lay still. He would let him die there, without lifting a finger to lengthen his life by a second. The sight of that shape, under the old brown blanket, inflamed his hatred. He looked, and turned away quickly, remembering always that second time Peter had dared to lay violent hands on his wife. It was that second time he could never forgive, that second time. The baby grew restless. He complained fretfully of his mother's lack of attention. Wally gave him, almost mechanically, the ends of the lines to play with. They pleased him for a while. Then he turned again to his mother, unable to fathom her sternness. Never before had her hands touched him so coldly. Looking right ahead of her, she would pull that little shawl tightly around him again, after he had succeeded in working his bare arms out of it, tucking him in without a kiss or any coaxing. His eyes studied her face, and found there no thought for him. He stood up in her lap. He put his arms around her neck, and stroked the forbidden feather. She failed even to reprove him. He seized the chance, and put the curling thing into his mouth, and chewed the end of it experimentally. He spit it out in disgust. He sat down again in her lap, and began playing with the frogs on her new coat. He fingered the interesting fringe. He squirmed about more vigorously than ever. He called to her. He put his hands up to her face. She bent down and kissed him, but not as she usually gathered him against herself with warmth. The caress was hard and preoccupied, and he whispered a little. He tried pat-a-caking to get her to smile upon him. That, too, failed. Wally handed him the whip, and he shook it so fiercely that they had both hastily to rescue their faces from the blows he might have inflicted. Still his mother looked straight ahead. They came then to a low place. The horses could go only very slowly. The baby adjusted himself to the new motion of the wagon. There was a splashing of mud that made him giggle delightedly. It would have been a choice morning for any baby whose mother wasn't sitting frozen. Wee Johnny made the best of it. He kicked and giggled and squirmed about. The horses failed of their own accord to take their proper pace again. Wally had to speak to them. He slapped them lightly with the lines. "Get up, Nellie," he exclaimed. "What's the matter of you?" Wee Johnny moved his arms exactly as Wally had done. "Get up, Nellie," he said. "What's the matter of you?" He said all that, plainly, if not perfectly, and before he knew what was happening, his mother had seized him and was hugging him up against her, in the good old way, kissing him. "Get up, Nellie," he cooed. "What's the matter of you?" She had been so surprised, so delighted with her son's first sentence, that she had turned, even kissing him, to Wally. No joy complete unless he shared it. "Did you hear that?" she cried triumphantly, her face blossoming towards him. "Say it again, Lammy." And almost before Wally could smile in return, he stopped. He turned around. He thought he heard a groan from his load. He couldn't even smile at her, with that man possibly spying upon them. He looked, and from the end of the wagon that man had lifted his head a little, like a snake, and had seen the smile that Kirsty had turned upon her husband. And Wally, when he saw that face, it was the last thing in the world that he intended doing, but some way, in spite of himself, he achieved generosity. The spoil, it may have been, of ancestral struggle. At the terrible sight of that face, he pitied his enemy. That coward, in his damned way, had loved Kirsty, and in his tormented, sunken dying, he had seen all the sweet intimacy from which he had been shut out, and had sunk back, felled by the blow of that revelation. Wally had foregone revenge. He had forborne running a sword less sharp through his fallen enemy than Kirsty's wifely smile had been. In a flash, Wally saw himself sitting there by the woman, loved, living, not dying, full of strength and generations, while that man, loathed and rejected, was already burning in hell. The poor devil! He pulled the horses up suddenly, and gave his wife the lines. He climbed back to lift his cousin into a position less painful. Through holes in the old blanket, straws from beneath were scratching the ghastly face. There was a farmhouse not so far down the road. "I'll stop there and buy him a pillow," Wally resolved. End of section 17. End of The Able McLaughlins by Margaret Wilson.